Okay, welcome everyone to a test-driven approach to documenting RESTful APIs with Groovy and Spring REST docs. So I'm Jenn Strater, and the best way to follow me as well as find these slides is on Twitter. It's CodeGenerator. Thought that was pretty cute. So like I said, the slides should have gone out a few minutes ago on Twitter. You can follow along with the slides on Speaker Deck. And for reference, there are two examples that I'm going to go through today, and here are the links for each of those. So a little bit about me. I'm originally American. I, however, have been taking classes at the Technical University of Denmark. And working on a research project with Groovy and the compiler and CodeNarc and kind of a bunch of different topics that I thought were interesting. It's funded by a program called Fulbright, which is an exchange program between the US and various countries throughout the world. I do have to say, yeah, so part of that means that I go out and talk like this or learn about Danish culture and other things too. So prior to the Fulbright grant, I was a senior consultant at a company called Object Partners. You may be familiar with them. They're a consulting firm in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the US. And the work that I did for them is the subject of this talk. I'm also the co-founder of an organization called Great Ladies. We work to support and encourage more women to join the Groovy community. And as part of that, I also started a workshop series called Great Workshops that kind of teaches an introduction to Groovy, Grails, Gradle, various different Groovy technologies, and provides resources for where to go to learn more. So that is a little bit about me. Right. I am also starting a new job, so I'm moving to Berlin at the end of my Fulbright grant in June. So that'll be a exciting new adventure. And so now that you guys know a little bit about me, or all of you know a little bit about me, I'd like to know a little bit about you. I assume that if you're here, you have some idea of how to create a RESTful API. So kind of by a show of hands, who has used Spring Boot to create APIs? Okay, probably about 40%. Who is familiar with Ratpack? 6. More than my previous talks. Okay, and I imagine that most of you have used Grails? Yeah, okay, almost the entire room now. So these are 3 different frameworks that we can relate to in creating RESTful APIs in the Groovy community. And some of the examples that I'm going to go through use aspects of each of these. So when you create an API, what do you use for documentation? And of course, this isn't an inclusive list, but how many people have used Swagger and or some kind of other code-generated documentation? Okay, probably about half. And who has used ASCII Doctor, whether for documentation or just at all? Okay, a couple very enthusiastic hands, but there's a few. So I'm gonna probably go through a little bit more about what ASCII Doc and ASCII Doctor are, just for everyone who hasn't used it before. So now that you know a little bit about me, I know a little bit about you, I think that I can share my secret. I hate writing documentation. And I added the asterisk here now. So it's not the actual documentation that I don't like writing. It's having to repeat the same thing over and over again. So it's having to write all this boilerplate. I mean, that's why we like Groovy in the first place, right? Because it gets rid of a lot of the boilerplate. So when I was tasked with creating a centralized documentation solution for one of the client I was working at in the, it's been a while now, it was the fall of 2015. I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about writing out all of the documentation by hand for all of these different services. So we started kind of an investigation into what types of documentation we could use, and what tools we can include to make it better and make it easier. And so one of the first things that came up is what are some things that are important or that are similar across all of the different APIs across this large enterprise organization. So the first thing that kind of came up was where do the APIs fall in this REST maturity model? And if you aren't familiar with this, I pulled this from a blog post from Martin Fowler, which goes into a lot more detail on this is the Richardson model for maturity model for REST APIs. But the important thing here is that I like the characterization based on what things are included in your APIs. So whether or not you're following resource-based URLs, whether you're using proper HTTP verbs, and of course, whether or not you decide to use hypermedia. So we found in looking at all of the different APIs that most of them fell kind of between a level 1 and a level 2, which means that they aren't truly RESTful if you go through and read that blog post. But that doesn't mean that we want to necessarily find a documentation tool that supports just what we have, but will also grow when we want to, say, add hypermedia. And this is particularly important in documentation because Swagger in particular doesn't support hypermedia. But the goal of a tool like Spring RESTdocs is that it does right from the beginning and right out of the box. Okay. Also had to bring in Alvaro's wonderful slide. So as this company had kind of grown, it started out with this huge Grails monolith and then got split up into a bunch of different microservices. And microservices and the architecture of the system that eventually evolved played a pretty big role in documentation. In particular, having a consistent look and feel, because all of these services are deployed in different areas, and it was important that when you go from one service to another that you don't have to think about the documentation and navigating through it. We also wanted a way to show how the services work together, and that can be something that's very difficult when you're using a code-generated solution. The next thing was how we were going to handle central documentation, and this is pretty common and easily solved by various different tools. But things like how you document your security, patterns for what HTTP verbs and status codes you're using, and these are things that you kind of document once, and as long as you are implementing them consistently, you don't have to do that on every single endpoint. The last thing that came up was kind of the way that our documentation was going to look. So there are two different approaches to the way that the documentation looks. And so this one is a library called Swagger UI, and it's a doc or a screenshot I took from Kubernetes actually. And then on the right is an example doc from the Spring RESTdocs project. And so on the left, we can see that everything is kind of sorted by its URLs, by its resource names and everything, and then, by the endpoints, and then the one on the right is more resource-based, and you get subsections, and things are kind of grouped together in a different way. So some of the services that we had already were using the Swagger UI. We're using Swagger UI for documentation, but our CTO in particular wasn't particularly fond of the way that worked. He had to try and figure out what the endpoint was in order to get to the action that he wanted. So things on the right, the Spring RESTdocs approach had some advantages there, at least for them. So there are two things that I've kind of talked about. So there's Swagger, and then there's Spring RESTdocs. So Swagger is not just about documentation, and that's very, very important. So Swagger is really just a standardization for APIs that can be used for lots of different things. You can use it to create client libraries. You can use it for documentation, and there's lots of different things that plug in once you have a specified Swagger spec. Okay, so there are some approaches that you can use to get this into your Groovy project. The first one, of course, is Spring Fox. So Spring Fox is really simple to get started with. There's just two dependencies, and you get the generation of the Swagger specification from your code, as well as the UI if you want it. Okay. So like I said, yeah, two here. The key difference being, so this is the library for generating the spec, and then the second one is for generating the UI. You don't necessarily have to use them together either. You can use something different for the UI if you want. So of course this is a code-generated approach, and it makes it really hard to kind of go outside of the predefined defaults. The other option is to, of course, maintain your own custom Swagger specification and keep writing that and updating it. But I kind of already mentioned that I don't like a lot of boilerplate things, so I don't like the maintenance of this version in particular, so I thought there has to be something better, right? Okay. Next thing was, okay, so the UI, like I said, it was optional. You can either use the Spring Fox UI similarly, or you could also copy and maintain your own version of this library as well, particularly when we talk about some of the weaknesses. So when we were looking at Swagger and some of the things that were already implemented in the existing APIs, there were a few things that weren't perfect. So we were constantly finding that we had to customize what was there, particularly in the Swagger UI version that's included with Spring Fox. You also get into a whole bunch of annotations. So if you look there, all of those are just associated with defining the layout of what this is going to do, and there's no guarantee that this is even correct. So this is all added manually, and just describing it all in the same place. This isn't a particularly long example, but it's one that fit on my slides. So if we take out just that part, we get something that's much smaller. So of course this code is actually code that I pulled from one of our services and then renamed everything. So if you imagine that this, all of those annotations get duplicated across all of the endpoints over all of the controllers, there's a lot of extra things in the source code that make it a lot harder to read. We also started getting even longer annotations when our response objects didn't exactly match what was expected, and we had to keep customizing everything, and we were slowly losing losing many of the advantages of having a code-generated solution when we were having to write everything out anyway. But there is one very important or very useful thing about the Swagger UI, and that is the try it button. So it was really nice for our QA team to be able to test things. You can put examples in the box there, try it against the running server, and it works pretty well. But once you start adding security to your API, you have to think about how that's going to work, and it wasn't working in some of our APIs. But that's not the end. So there are some alternatives to using the try it button, and the first one is to include a Postman collection. So Postman collections are a group of endpoints that you can run in Postman, and it kind of saves a bunch of defaults and things. It's not integrated with Spring Rust docs right now, but you could easily create some collections and include that in your documentation. The run button that's included with Postman by default is only for public API, so that's also worth noting, but you can have just a collection as well. You can also run curl statements. It's not as nice as the UI, but when you have a solution like Spring Rust docs that outputs those curl statements, you don't have to think about what flags and everything to add. You can just include it. So of course, like I said, so some of these steps are optional. You can also mix Spring Rust docs with Swagger and get some of the advantages of both. So you can have the spec and some of the other integrations and nice things that come from Swagger, as well as getting the test-driven approach of Spring Rust docs. And in order to do that, well, I said if you're going to do that, there are two libraries that make it a little bit easier. So the first one is called Swagger to Markup, and so rather than using the Swagger UI, it takes Swagger and converts it to Markdown or ASCII doc, which you can also use with the snippets that Spring Rust docs generates. And so yeah, you get the thing that I was talking about with the way that the APIs are laid out, that you get, it is still a little bit of a path thing, but all of that is configurable. I do also highly recommend using some kind of tool to verify that those annotations that were on the code are actually matching up with what you expected, as well as what was actually implemented. So Assert.j Swagger is a library for contract first. So it will verify that what you intended is matches up with the spec that's generated from Swagger. Okay. But it will not, of course, verify that what was actually implemented matches what you expected, but we'll get to that. Okay. So that brings me to what we're calling the test-driven approach to documentation. And it kind of came out of this idea that there has to be something better, right? So we're adding documentation between, okay, so we start with your filling tests. In order to make your test go green, you also have to add documentation. And that becomes more important after you get to like refactoring. You know that when you refactor, you have to also update your documentation in order for your test to go green. Hopefully you're hooking that into your build, and your build's actually failing when your documentation's out of date. Okay. So the reason why I really liked this approach is because it, of course, ensured that the documentation actually matches what was implemented. We also found that it encouraged us to write a lot more tests. So in order to get the snippets and everything that's generated, we had to write the test to get there. And in doing that, we found a lot of edge cases that we wouldn't have otherwise, because, of course, we aren't the greatest at writing tests if we don't have to. It also reduced a lot of the duplication. So maybe you already had tests and you already had the docs. You're writing that in two places. You don't necessarily need to do it that way. You can have the docs generated in the tests and remove it from the source. Okay. So of all the approaches to test-driven documentation, and actually Spring RESTdocs is the only one I know of right now. Spring RESTdocs is a great library to do that. So just as a little bit of an overview, of course it's an official Spring project. It is sponsored by Pivotal. It's run by one of the Spring developers, Andy Wilkinson, and the current latest release is 1.1.2, but there is now a release candidate coming out for the 1.2 series that I'll go into a little bit more detail on. Oh, I should also note that that is not the official image. There isn't one, so I made it. And that'll come up a few more times in the slides. So things that really changed the game as far as Spring RESTdocs. It generated these code snippets, the requests, the responses, and everything, and it ensures, based on the way that everything's hooked together, that your tests are failing when your documentation's out of date. It's also really useful in cases where you can't use another solution like Swagger. So this comes into play for two cases in particular. So the one that Andy talks about in some of his talks is hypermedia. And I'm not going to have or go into too much about that, because the other thing that I wanted to talk about is how to use it in Ratpack. So for the few people that have used Ratpack, they're familiar that Ratpack handles or has route handling that's a little bit different than most other things. It's dynamic. So that means that you can't predict what endpoints are going to exist. And therefore you can't use a code-generated solution because it can't find the way that that's going to work. So you can use Spring RESTdocs, or you could create your own custom Swagger specification to do APIs with Ratpack, but I definitely like the Spring RESTdocs approach better. So now that you've heard a little bit about the journey of how we got here, you may want to know how to do this yourself. So you should, of course, read the documentation. It's a documentation project, so the docs are pretty good. There's also two other talks that I highly recommend. The first one, it is a little bit dated now, so it's from what was Spring 1.2 GX in 2015 from the project lead. And I really still like this video because it goes into a lot of the reasoning for why things are the way they are, and how they're implemented. As a follow-up, this last year at what is now Spring 1 platform, Anders Evers has a much more in-depth example. This is particularly good to watch if you want to see how to do hypermedia or how to do this in Java. Okay, and of course, any talk from either of those two is going to be great. So now that Spring RESTdocs has been out long enough, I can actually do a release highlight section. So in the first version in 1.0 that went sometime in the fall of 2015. So it was pretty perfect timing for when we were doing this project, because the 1.0 came out, we were right in the right category. We were using Spring Boot, and we could hook into some of the things from the beginning. So in the beginning, it did just have mock MVC as the testing framework, but that was okay for our Spring Boot project. It was very important from the beginning to have these generated snippets and the ASCII doctor integration right from the beginning, as well as the hypermedia support. The thing that the next release, though, was the one that I was most excited about, because it allowed me to use it on more projects other than just Spring. Because it added Rest Assured, I can now use it with Grails and Ratpack and lots of other things. There were also some minor things to help with reusable snippets. There's now some more testing frameworks, and you can use Markdown if you really want to. Okay. So then the next major release that's coming is this 1.2, and it's kind of been a while. So the one the latest release happened in August, and now we're at the release candidate, so it hasn't even come out yet. But there are some really exciting things coming in this next release that will make it even easier to get your documentation done. And that is with the use of an ASCII doctor macro, which will eliminate even more boilerplate from your documentation. It also helps or supports some more complex payloads. So we were starting to notice this a little bit, that depending on the structure, particularly in JSON, if you have something that's kind of deeply nested, a table may not be the best way to represent that, because you end up with these notations for when something is nested, and I'll kind of show what that looks like in the demo. But it's really exciting that some of these things are getting fixed. And of course, it is an open source project, so if you're looking for something to hack on, there are definitely more issues that you can work on. Okay, so the thing that I wanted to add to this in particular is, how do we make this Spring REST docs, or how do we bring it into Groovy projects? And so I'm going to go through a little bit about the original with Spring Boot, and then for today's session, I'll go through the Ratpack example. I do have a Grails example as well, but I haven't updated it in a while, so I picked the Ratpack one for this version. Okay, so first we can get started with Spring Boot. So it's a pretty standard project. I added the ASCII Dr. Gradle plugin. In this case, we're using mock MVC as the testing framework, and of course, it has to be Spock, right? Okay. So then I also added, there's two different approaches for like where to send these docs. You can either include it in the application, and then you would include it on each one in the case of like microservices, or you could build them together and deploy them to a central remote location, kind of like you would with the GitHub Pages example. Okay. So I started with lazybones. Use the basic template for getting started with Spring Boot, and I just added a few trivial demo examples. For reference, again, here's the link to the example project. Okay. So this is a little bit of what it looks like. So we have a resource that's greetings, and then you have a sample GET request, a GET by ID, and a post. Okay. So then, okay, and I am going about this a little bit backwards. If you're doing TDD, you of course start with your test first. But for going through this way, we started with the endpoints, then added the ASCII Dr. Gradle plugin. So from the show of hands at the beginning, there weren't that many people that were familiar with ASCII Doctor. So ASCII Doc is a really great format for writing documentation. It's going to be similar to Markdown if you've used that before. And the ASCII Doctor plugin that you can use with Gradle it takes that ASCII Doc format and then converts it into other things like PDFs, HTML, or you can even use it to write books. Okay. So it is really easy to add with Gradle. There's a few things with configuration and kind of setting up how you want this doc to look. You can customize a lot of this as well. And so what happens when this task runs is that it takes an example ASCII doc, which like this, and you should. This actually came from a different project, but same idea, and it converts that into an HTML page or a PDF or different formats. Okay. So then we have, at this point, some example endpoints. We have some basic documentation, but we haven't hooked in our tests yet. So in the beginning, there was just mock MVC, and there are a few things, and actually I should note as well in here that this does work. This works for Spring Boot. This will not work for Grails, based on how things plug in. And I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics. So the first way to get started with mock MVC is that it hooks in just at the level of the controller. And this is pretty simple if you just want to do a demo, but your examples are probably going to be much more complicated than just testing a single controller. So you're going to want to include the entire web context in here. And then hopefully I can save you a lot of time from a mistake that I made very early on. Remember to use the right version of Spock. So this is very heavily dependent on everything Spring, so you need Spock Spring. Okay. Okay. Right, so I kind of had skipped over this part. So yeah, so you have the standalone setup, and then the part here is where it's actually performing each of the requests. Alternatively, could you just do the different setup? Okay, so now we have some endpoints. We have the ASCII docs. We have some basic tests, and we can hook in our documentation. And so we're going to need to go back to the Gradle file and include a couple of things. We want to specify where these snippets are going to go, as well as now we need to actually add our dependency for Spring REST docs. It's very important for this part that you pick the right one. So there's a different one for Rest Assured and mock MVC, which keeps these a little bit smaller so you don't have to include everything. The important things, of course, is important thing in the ASCII doc task configuration is how to include these snippets and where it's going to find them. Okay. So to get started with Spring REST docs, we have to do a little bit of setup, and so it's just specifying where this output is going to go and how to hook in to the requests that are already running. Okay. So most of the rest of this is about the actual performing of the request. The important part for documentation here is to hook in this and do on the document. So it's the first thing there is where you want it to go. So of course, it would be suggested that each endpoint has its own directory where all of the snippets go. If you want to do any pre-processing, post-processing, things like pretty print or manipulating what your URLs look like, and then the response fields. And you'll notice over and over again that you're doing a lot of the same things, so it's really helpful to put these out into a separate method. And that's kind of where that reusable snippets thing came out in the 1.1 version. Okay. So what happens when you run a test that looks like that is that you get a lot of different things in this output directory that I've set up to be in the docs folder. So you get a curl request that was generated, and all of the ones that are in asterisks are the ones that come by default. And then the rest are ones that are only included if you specify that. So if you include that you want the request fields, then it will include that as well. Yeah, so things like curl requests, you get HTTP and HTTP as well, depending on what kind of request format you want. The response does come in one format, HTTP response, but of course you can always configure and add more things to this. Okay. So this is kind of what those snippets look like when they get included into an ASCII doc file and then run. So you get curl with all of the options. In this case, we're running against localhost, so you'll see that that's included, but you can change that as well, because you're gonna probably not want it to include localhost, but the actual URL that you're trying to document. And then you get a response, and then this response structure, as it was at this point, was just a table of all of the different fields. Yeah, and that works for simple cases. So the next thing that you might want to do is document the create or the new greeting. So there's a couple different things here. Mostly, if you go back and look at these later and try to walk through it, that we have request fields now. So request fields documents the body of the JSON that you're going to post, as well as showing some things like you can make them optional. Okay. So similarly, that test got converted into a table that now includes request fields. Since it's a create, there's no response, it's just the 201, so you don't have that table. Okay. Now, so I was talking a little bit about how, depending on the structure of your output, it can get a little bit tricky. So when you do a list, you start adding these square brackets, and that'll then be output into the table as well. But hopefully, if you read through the docs, you should see that. But if you're stuck, it's probably one of the braces. Okay. You can also use it to document path parameters, and this is all pretty similar. Okay. So the new and exciting thing that is actually more of a Spring Boot thing than a Spring RESTdocs thing is that if you are in the small case where you're using Spring Boot and mock MVC and versions Spring Boot 1.4 or higher, there's actually now an annotation that's included in Spring Boot that eliminates some of the setup too. So you can add it as an annotation, and so the way that this is set up, the code that's commented out is what is generated or replaced by the annotation at the top. So you can remove even more boilerplate code. Okay. So that covers how to write some of the tests and how to get started. So now that you're probably in the point of actually running them, you'll start seeing some failing tests. And I actually like the output because it's really useful that you get the parts of the payload that are, that were there that were not documented, or vice versa. And it doesn't just do whether or not it exists, it can also check types. Now, that's not so exciting for JSON because you only have a few different types, but it does still catch between ID and, or between number and string. Imagine this is a lot more useful for like XML. Okay. So once you get all of your tests to pass, you're probably going to, or maybe probably do this in phases, you can include your snippets back into your ASCII doc. And so this is really just specific to the way that ASCII doc and ASCII doctor work. And of course, if you want to learn more, there are lots of great talks about ASCII doctor and the Gradle plugin. But the idea here is that you get all of those snippets that were generated, you then have to manually insert those into your doc. But what's exciting and coming next is a little bit of a shortcut, which will remove some of that those templates, and then work better. But of course, this is still in release candidate, hasn't been officially released yet. Okay. So we have our endpoints, we have our docs, we have our tests are passing, and we should be ready to build it. So based on the examples, I take what's in my source directory, and that contains a folder where all of my docs were generated, and it's very important that those tests are run before the ASCII Doctor task so that they exist when they actually get built by the ASCII Doctor plugin. And so what we get as a final product is a very nice document that you can see on GitHub pages for this example. Okay, so that is the first one. It's also really exciting that you can now use Rest Assured. So Rest Assured opens the door to some more frameworks such as Ratpack and Grails. So the one that I added is actually in part of the sample projects for Ratpack in example books, and the links there are for the entire project as well as a little bit more of an example. It's the pull request, and so it's all of the code from that pull request. And I'm going to walk through a couple of the changes. So you of course want to make sure that you're adding the right version of Spring REST docs. Remember that changes, as well as your output directory is going to change, which is true of switching any framework. If you're not as familiar with Gradle, I did add it as a separate folder. Anyway, okay. So then we get to Ratpack's handling. So this may not look familiar to some of you, but here's what it means. So this is just to get a book by its ISBN number. You can get all the books, and you can post and create. So all of the same examples that I had for Spring REST docs are also hold true for the Ratpack example, just with books instead of greetings. As a reminder, the ASCII doc stuff works pretty much the same. So in this case, we're adding Spring REST docs with Rest Assured, and the setup's a little bit different. And part of this is because when it went from 1.0 to 1.1, a few of the class names changed. They're still in there, but you may get a deprecated message if you're using the old one. This one, of course, is the newer version. Okay, so the configuration on the surface looks pretty similar, but Rest Assured and MockMVC work very differently. Whereas MockMVC hooks into the Spring stack, it doesn't actually run against, and it creates a mock, which is why it's called MockMVC. Rest Assured actually runs against the application. So that's kind of why it's a little bit more difficult to hook in something like Spring REST docs, and also why you have to use Rest Assured for something like Ratpack and Grails. Okay, so in the Ratpack example, most of this is just setup and test stuff. But the important part here is that it's using a filter instead. And one of the things to note just in the last couple minutes here is that it's really important that you don't change the API or the URL before the request happens, otherwise it'll actually go against a remote one, which you can use then to run against a public API. And yeah, so I then exploit it to run it against something else, which may seem a little bit strange, like why would I want to run it? But maybe you don't have access to the API that you're trying to document, or if you're kind of behind a few different layers, you may want to run your doc tests against the beginning and not something deep embedded in the system. Okay, so there's also a Gradle plugin to publish the docs, and that's how I used it to get to GitHub pages. And this may be important for something like if you're doing a small API and you don't have views, or like the Grails web profile. But remember that if you're using this method to remember to deploy your docs at the same time, and you'll have to figure out that pipeline. So that is an example of how to run through there. So of course, my project finally made it to production. The team is still really happy with Spring REST docs, even though I'm not there anymore. And the other devs that are having to interact with it seem pretty happy. You can read the docs for a lot more things on that I didn't have time to cover. And yeah, so API documentation is complex. Choose the right tool, not just the one that's easiest to set up. And I still hate writing documentation, but at least it's a little bit less painful now. Join the Groovy Slack, and if you want Spring REST doc specific things, they are on Gitter. Sorry I went a little bit over, so I don't have time for questions. Oh. Okay. I'm also here today and tomorrow, so you can do that.
The spring stuff looks great. I was wondering why. It's probably a hard biased question, but I mean, why would you use the Swagger stuff versus the spring stuff? It just seems like it's so much better.
Yeah.
The spring stuff's so much better.
So as a documentation solution, I definitely like Spring REST docs better, particularly when you compare it to like just the Swagger UI. But Swagger is a lot more than just the documentation. So a lot of people are already using Swagger for other things, particularly generating client libraries. And there's I mean, a whole industry now of things that are built on top of the Swagger specs that you can plug and play. So if you've already invested in setting up Swagger, you may continue to go in that direction. But there, like I'd kind of mentioned, there's no reason why you can't still generate your Swagger spec and generate your documentation from Spring REST docs.